In the winter of 1943, something happened in England that the United States Army never wanted written down. Black American soldiers stepped off transport ships expecting the same rules that had governed their lives. Since birth, separate doors, separate drinks, separate dignity. Instead, they walked into English cities where none of those rules applied. They were served in pubs without hesitation. They were spoken to with curiosity instead of hatred. They danced with white women in public, halls without violence following them into the night. And somewhere behind palace walls, a question was reportedly asked that sent shockwaves through military command. Why are these men being treated differently at all? The soldiers didn't hear that question directly. What they heard were rumors whispered in barracks after midnight. Stories passed between units stationed in Bristol, Bath, and London. Stories about British officials refusing to enforce American segregation. Stories about pub owners throwing out white American military police instead of black soldiers. Stories about a British colonel staring down a US officer and declaring that Jim Crow had no authority on British soil. And then the most dangerous story of all, that the Queen herself had demanded assurances that black American troops would be treated as equals. No one could prove it. No one dared ask officially. But something unmistakable was happening. American military police began patrolling British streets, not to protect soldiers, but to control them. Black GIs were beaten for drinking in the same pubs as white soldiers, arrested for dancing with British women, punished for experiencing a freedom the army feared could never be taken back. The war against Hitler was being fought in the skies, but another war was unfolding on the ground, a quiet, brutal battle over race, power, and control. Because once a man sees a world without chains, the old ones stop holding. And England, battered by bombs and blackouts, accidentally showed thousands of black American soldiers what equality looked like. The United States Army knew that was dangerous. What they didn't know was how much damage had already been done. By 1942, the United States was losing the war before it had truly begun to understand it. Pearl Harbor had dragged the nation into global conflict, and within months, tens of thousands of American troops were pouring into Britain under Operation Bolero, the massive build-up that would eventually lead to D-Day. Among them were more than 100,000 black soldiers, men the army needed desperately but still refused to treat as equals. Official policy labeled them unfit for combat leadership, suitable mainly for labor, logistics, and support units, even as they trained and prepared under the same threat of German bombs. They crossed the Atlantic, wearing the uniform of a country that demanded their service but denied their humanity. Britain in 1942 was a nation under siege. Cities like London, Bristol, Liverpool, and Coventry still bore the scars of the Blitz. Streets smelled of soot and damp stone. Windows were boarded, lights dimmed, and every night carried the possibility of air raids. Food was rationed, coal was scarce, and exhaustion hung over the population like a second fog. Yet Britain had one thing the American army did not expect: no legal system of racial segregation. Prejudice existed, curiosity existed, ignorance existed, but Jim Crow did not. There were no whites-only signs, no laws dictating who could drink where, dance with whom, or walk which side of the street. The American military assumed Britain would adapt. Commanders issued guidance instructing British authorities to establish separate facilities for black and white troops, warning that racial mixing would damage morale and discipline. Memos circulated quietly, urging discretion, suggesting cooperation, implying pressure. What they failed to understand was that Britain, already sacrificing its sons and cities, had no intention of importing America's racial order. As black American soldiers disembarked into English ports, they carried more than rifles and packs. They carried the habits of survival learned in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. Eyes lowered, voices softened, expectations reduced. But England was about to confront them with a contradiction so profound it would unsettle everything they thought they knew about the world and about themselves. Sergeant James Holey was 24 years old when he arrived in England. In November 1942, a carpenter's son from Birmingham, Alabama, raised on rules that were never written down, but always enforced. He learned early when to step aside on sidewalks, when not to meet a white man's eyes, when silence was safer than truth. The army had promised him travel, purpose, and honor, but delivered instead segregated barracks, menial assignments, and white officers who saw him as a problem to be managed rather than a soldier to be trusted. Still, Holley carried himself with quiet discipline, shaped by a lifetime of learning how to endure without breaking. Private Marcus Wright, 3 years younger and from rural Georgia, had grown up in the shadow of cotton fields and debt. His grandfather had been a sharecropper, his father the same. School ended early for Marcus, not because he lacked ability, but because labor mattered more than learning. The draft reached him before opportunity ever did. England was the first place he had ever traveled beyond his home county, and everything about it felt unreal. The accents, the stone buildings, the absence of visible racial boundaries. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Morrison stood apart from both men, one of the few black officers to survive the Army's relentless effort to sideline them. Morrison understood power intimately, how it was exercised, withdrawn and denied. He spoke carefully, dressed impeccably, and carried the weight of representing his entire race in every room he entered. British officers listened to him differently than American ones did, not with deference but with curiosity and, at times, respect. Surrounding them were unnamed forces, just as influential British dock workers, who stared but did not threaten. Pub owners who refused to discriminate. American military police determined to impose segregation at any cost. Together, these individuals would collide in ways none of them fully understood, shaping a quiet but explosive chapter of wartime. History that would linger long after the guns fell silent. The tension built quietly at first, in moments small enough to be dismissed but sharp enough to cut. Black American soldiers were served in pubs in Bristol and Bath, and white American soldiers noticed. British women danced with black GIs at social halls organized by the Red Cross, and American officers began filing reports. Military police increased their patrols, not because crime had risen, but because fear had. Fear that discipline was eroding, fear that soldiers would return home changed, fear that segregation could not survive exposure. Incidents followed in rapid succession. In December 1942, an American MP attempted to remove a black corporal from a pub on Broadmead in Bristol, only to be blocked by the owner and ejected by British patrons. Days later in Bath, 2 black soldiers were arrested for conduct unbecoming after dancing with local women, despite no British law being broken. Each clash ended the same way: confusion, embarrassment, and resentment growing on both sides. What American command did not anticipate was British resistance. City councils refused to designate segregated venues. Pub owners posted signs reading, "All Allied servicemen welcome." British military police quietly sided with civilians when American MPs overstepped. Newspapers published editorials criticizing American racial practices, calling them incompatible with the values Britain claimed to be defending in the war. Within the barracks, rumors multiplied. Soldiers whispered about meetings between British officials and American commanders that ended abruptly. They spoke of British colonels openly challenging segregation orders. They wondered how far this unexpected protection extended and whether it could last. Then the violence escalated. Black soldiers were beaten outside pubs for refusing to leave. White MPs dragged men into alleys, clubs swinging. Anger no longer disguised as discipline. Each beating sent a message meant to restore control. Instead, it hardened resolve, because every blow landed on British soil carried a new meaning. It wasn't just punishment anymore. It was proof that something fundamental was breaking, and no one knew what would replace it. The truth emerged not in a proclamation, but in fragments, conversations overheard, orders quietly altered, enforcement suddenly inconsistent. By early 1943, it became clear that American segregation in Britain was no longer fully backed by British authority. Behind closed doors, British military liaison officers had drawn a line the United States did not expect. They would cooperate in war planning, logistics, and defense, but they would not legally enforce racial separation. That responsibility, and the blame that came with it, would rest solely with the American command. It was during this period that the most dangerous story began circulating with remarkable consistency. Officers spoke of a planning meeting in London in January 1943, where an American commander outlined segregation requirements to a British colonel. The response was immediate and cold. Britain, he said, did not recognize racial distinctions among Allied soldiers. When pressed, the colonel claimed the issue had already reached the highest levels of government. According to multiple retellings, when the arrival of black American troops was discussed at court, the Queen asked to be assured that they would be treated with the same respect and dignity as any other servicemen on British soil. No official transcript has ever surfaced. No written order bears her name. Yet the effects were undeniable. British officials stopped cooperating with segregation requests. Local authorities refused to assist American MPs. British military police intervened when violence escalated. Segregation did not vanish, but it lost its legitimacy. The revelation was not simply that a royal figure may have spoken against discrimination. It was that American power overseas had limits. The United States could export troops, weapons, and influence, but it could not fully export Jim Crow. For black soldiers, this realization was seismic. It meant their treatment was not universal, not inevitable, not endorsed by the entire civilized world. That knowledge was dangerous. Once learned, it could not be undone. And the American army understood something too late. England had become a mirror, and what it reflected back was intolerable. The fallout was immediate and quietly severe. American command adjusted tactics without admitting defeat. Black units were moved away from major cities when possible, relocated to isolated camps where British influence was weaker and supervision easier. Recreational passes were restricted. Social events were cancelled under the language of security and efficiency. None of it was labeled punishment, but everyone understood its purpose. The brief exposure to equality had to be contained. Violence increased rather than decreased. American military police intensified patrols, and beatings became more calculated. Reports were buried. Charges against MPs were dismissed. Black soldiers learned which streets to avoid and which pubs would draw attention. British civilians, once openly defiant, were encouraged by their own authorities to avoid confrontation in the name of Allied unity. The resistance did not disappear, but it became quieter, more cautious. When black American units began shipping out to North Africa and Italy, in mid-1943, many soldiers left England with a sense of loss deeper than fear. They were heading into combat zones where survival was uncertain, yet what weighed on them was leaving behind a place where, for a moment, they had lived without constant humiliation. Letters home changed in tone. Some spoke carefully of British kindness. Others said nothing at all, knowing such stories could invite trouble. The long-term consequences unfolded slowly. Soldiers returned to the United States, carrying memories that no amount of propaganda could erase. They had seen a functioning society without enforced segregation. They had walked streets where their skin did not dictate their worth. That knowledge followed them into post-war America, into factories, unions, churches, and eventually into the early civil rights movement. For Britain, the episode faded into wartime memory, overshadowed by victory and recovery. For America, it lingered unspoken, an uncomfortable truth that the fight for freedom abroad had exposed the lie of freedom at home, and that exposure could not be undone. By the time the war ended in 1945, the moment had already slipped into legend. No medals were issued for it. No official histories recorded it in full. Yet for the black American soldiers who had lived it, England remained a reference point, a brief, undeniable proof that the world did not have to be organized by humiliation. They returned to a United States unchanged on the surface, where segregation still governed schools, jobs, housing, and even the uniform they had worn in service. But something inside them was no longer intact in the way America required it to be. Whether the Queen ever spoke those words exactly as remembered matters less than why the story endured. It endured because it answered a question black Americans had been asking for generations. Is this how it must be everywhere, or only here? England, battered and rationed and under constant threat of annihilation, had unintentionally delivered the answer. The cruelty was not universal, the system was not natural. It was enforced. History often turns on moments that never appear in documents. A refusal, a look, a line that could not be crossed. In this case, it was the quiet rejection of American segregation on foreign soil that exposed its fragility. Power was revealed not as absolute but as conditional, and once that illusion cracked, it could never fully be repaired. Decades later, as the civil rights movement reshaped the United States, many veterans would recognize the source of their certainty. They had seen another way to live. They had breathed it. They had danced to it. And they had been punished for it. So the real question is not what the Queen said, but why the idea that she said it mattered so much. Why it traveled from barracks to barracks long after bombs stopped falling, and why even now it unsettles us. Because if dignity was possible, then under fire in a foreign land, what excuse remains now? And if that brief moment of equality could exist once, what is stopping it from existing again?